Good evening and welcome. My name is David Andreozzi. I'm an architect and the president of the New England chapter of the ICAA, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. Today, we're here to welcome Eric Daum, the founding president of the New England ICAA chapter, to introduce us to the late Martin Hedmark, a young Swedish architect who came to the United States in late 1924 to launch his career, primarily as an architect for Swedish congregations and cultural institutions in America. But before we start, a couple of points. First, our next lecture will be on May 5th in alliance with the Antiques magazine in celebration of Boston Design Week. We will host Cece Haydock as she details Renaissance garden making and how it was interpreted by English gardeners of the earliest 20th century. Next, on May 13th, David Rao will present Reawakening, a new modern perspective on how to view our place in the world through architecture based on simple fundamentals of our environment, our people, and our planet. Finally, we will be doing a Q&A session at the end of Eric's talk, in which we hope will be as dynamic as the presentation itself. Please save your questions until then and then post them in the Q&A window, which opens with a button on the bottom of your screen. But that being said, please open up the chat window and introduce yourself. Let us know where you're all from. So for those of you new to the ICA, we are a leading nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of the classical tradition in architecture, urbanism, and the allied arts. We do this through education, publication, and advocacy. The Institute, our mothership, is headquartered in New York with 16 regional chapters across the United States. Nationally, the ICA offers a broad range of educational programs, including intensives for architecture and design students, introductory programs for middle school students, lectures and walking tours for the public, continuing education courses for professionals and enthusiasts, and in better times, travel programs to visit classical masterpieces around the United States and throughout the world. We also do publishing of original and reprinted books and an annual journal called the Classicist. Regionally, in addition to providing educational tours that I just mentioned, our New England chapter hosts our Bullfinch Awards annually, this year at the Harvard Club, hopefully, in Boston on October 2nd. There, we will honor New England's best accomplishments in traditional and classical architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, and the allied arts. This year's events will also offer keynote speakers from two people, Thomas Lupke, Secretary of the U.S. Commission of the Fine Arts, and Carol Westphal, past chairman of Notre Dame School of Architecture, the most renowned program in traditional classical architecture and urban design, and there is no close second. This year will actually be a combined event celebrating the laureates from 2020 and 2011 together for one wonderful evening. Please consider joining us for the celebration, but more importantly, please consider submitting your work to our Bullfinch Award at classicist-ne.org. If you have any questions about joining our organization, our executive director, Sarah McDonald, will post her contact information right now in the chat box. Please reach out to her directly and ask any questions you want, and please join us. Eric Daum is a senior architect at and design director at Carpenter McNeil Architects. He currently sits on our ICA board after serving as president of our chapter from 2005 to 2009. He was elected fellow of National ICA in 2018. Eric was awarded our prestigious Bullfinch Award in 2019 and 220 Tucker Design Award for a Greek Revival private chapel on an estate south of Boston. His work has been featured in Boston Design Guide and Traditional Building magazine. This passion for historic architecture has led him to teach residential design at the Boston Architectural College, lecture at the Traditional Building Conference, Build Boston, the ICA in both Boston and New York, and for the Providence Preservation Society. He has written articles on design process for Traditional Building Magazine and Qualified Remodeler. He has appeared on Chronicle Magazine in 2006 as an advocate for the city's rich architectural heritage and served as a juror for the national prestigious Palladio Awards in both 2016 and 2020. Eric holds a Master of Architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University and a BA in History from Columbia. Please welcome our friend, our fellow board member, and our official bon vivant, Eric Daum.
Thank you, David. I don't know what to say about that. And thank you to everybody who signed up. I hope you get your money's worth. And given that this is a free talk, I probably don't have a very high bar to hit. I just wanted to start out by saying, here I need to share my screen. I just wanted to start out by saying that this talk was originally scheduled to take place. Actually, David, can I just give me a thumbs up if it's showing? Okay. This talk was originally scheduled to take place in April of 2020 as a joint production for Boston Design Week by the ICAA New England and the Swedish Cultural Center in Newton, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, it was postponed. I've continued to do a little bit of research since then, and so I've been able to flesh out the talk a bit more. It's an elaboration of a talk that I gave in 2013 at the Providence Preservation Society on endangered churches in Providence. And this significant building at one time really, the congregation had fallen to almost nothing, and there was a serious concern that the building would go out of use. It's actually thriving now with a new congregation and seems to be doing well. Although the people who are currently in the building don't necessarily know its heritage nor seem to respect some of the artifacts within the building. Let me start with Gloria Dei Evangelical Lutheran Church in Providence was designed by Martin Hedmark, a Swedish architect, and it offers a sophisticated commentary on the evolution of early 20th century Swedish architecture. Within the design of the church, constructed between 1925 and 1928, is evidence of two seemingly contradictory early modern architectural schools. On the exterior, an essay in the National Romantic movement, which was the first national language of the Scandinavian countries in Finland, and in the interior, an emerging style which came to be known as Nordic Classicism. Martin Hedmark completed his studies and commenced his career as the stylistic transformation from National Romanticism to Nordic Classicism was taking place in Sweden. He graduated from Stockholm's Kungliga Tekniska Högskolan, or the Royal Technical College, in 1921, and worked in the office of Lars Israel Wallman, a leading professor at KTH and the architect of the landmark Engelbrekt Church in Stockholm. Wallman was considered Sweden's foremost church architect, and Hedmark would be exposed to a body of work which would have a profound influence on all of his future American projects. So I actually discovered this building in 1986. I grew up in Providence and was completely unaware of it, but I had gone as an architecture student to Scandinavia and Finland to see the works of the Nordic classical movement. And there I had actually seen for the first time also the buildings of the National Romantic period. And I fell in love with the architecture, and it reached me in a very deep sort of way. And I had come home on a weekend from grad school with a bag of laundry in my car to visit my parents in Providence. And at that time, Providence was undergoing a massive transformation. The Capitol Center project moved rivers and railroad tracks and was essentially remaking the entire center of the city. And so every time I came, I wanted to check it out. And I turned down Hayes Street, a street I had been down many times before, but because I had just returned from Sweden, I caught out of the corner of my eye something that felt incredibly familiar. I slammed on the brakes and stood half in and out of my car, marveling at this building, which I had never noticed before. And first I looked at the lantern over the front door and the gilded angel. And then I looked at the stepped tower for the bell tower. And then the cupola on this little tower on the western front. And then zooming in, I could suddenly see it's capped by a Viking ship. And I'm standing in the middle of the street, half in and out of my car with my jaw agape. And the minister happened to walk out of the church and he asked if he could help me. And I sputtered out, "Is this a Swedish church?" And he said, "Well, it was at one time, it is no longer, but it was founded by a Swedish congregation. Would you like to come in and see the interior?" And so I was marveling at this Nordic National Romantic exterior, and I walked into the interior, and there's a full-blown Nordic classical interior. And it's remarkable to me that these two different architectural styles should exist within one building, but also this is the only example of Nordic classicism that I know that made it across the ocean. I wrote to John Stewart, who wrote a recent book on Nordic classicism, who's an English architect and scholar, and mentioned this church to him, and he had never heard of it, but he remarked that he was quite pleased to see that something in this style had made it across the pond. So, Bjorn Lind describes Swedish history as a cyclical succession of expansion and contraction. And during the latter part of the 19th century, Scandinavia, like most of the Western world, experienced rapid industrialization and urbanization. The cultural transformation from a rural to an industrial economy gave rise to a self-conscious patriotic movement, National Romanticism. The desire to accommodate rapid social change, both in terms of the built environment, but also through social engineering, created an array of institutions to carry on the burden of modernizing the Swedes. This contemporary movement towards standardization and industrialization soon faced an artistic undercurrent influenced by native craft. Lind states that architectural form was derived from real material and craft, and he describes craftsmen as being freed from having to precisely copy what the architect drew and to leave visible traces of their work and their tools on the work. Students were encouraged to find precedents in the simple architecture of Sweden's past and in the concept of material realism. In his essay on Swedish modern classicism in context, Stuart Knight wrote, "The rationalizing tendencies that transformed Stockholm in the 19th and 20th centuries also affected the architectural profession. The result was a constantly shifting dialectic between modernity and rationalization on one hand, and between tradition and artistic expression on the other." So the buildings of early 20th century Sweden, designed for this evolving modern culture and rendered in traditional Swedish forms, sought to synthesize modernity and tradition to create a wholly new national style. And the foreign influences that bore front in this were Jugendstil from Germany, the medieval forms of the English arts and crafts, and H.H. Richardson's Romanesque revival from America. So looking at National Romanticism and Engelbrecht's Kirche, the result was Engelbrecht Kirche was a result of a design competition won by Lars Israel Wallman in 1906, and it was not completed until the eve of the First World War in 1914. Wallman was born in the small city of Hedemora in Dalarna, like his student Martin Hedmark. He was a graduate of KTH, where he later became a respected professor. Engelbrecht sits upon a large rock outcrop in North Stockholm on a site previously considered unbuildable. This peak provided a solid foundation and assured its visibility throughout the city. Wallman designed a tall bell tower like a beacon seen throughout Stockholm. Wallman was also looking at the castles of the 16th century for inspiration, not so much in the form of the building, but for details of masonry construction. And here, if we look at Gripsholm, and you can see on the tower, this arcade with blind arches, which are filled in with rendered stucco, and they meet at a single brick in Wythe. And Wallman recreated that same motif at Engelbrecht's Kirche. The nave was tall parabolic arches, which gave a sense of height despite their breadth. And the plan of the church is a Greek cross, but the effect of the interior mosaics is almost Byzantine, picking up on that medieval influence. But the details throughout this church feature delicate craftsmanship and rich materials. So Ragnar Östberg's Stadhuset, or Stockholm City Hall, opened in 1922 after a protracted design process that extended for nearly 20 years. This prominent site is visible from much of the city, and the soaring tower is one of Stockholm's significant landmarks. Perhaps alluding to the claim that Stockholm is the Venice of the North, Östberg drew upon not just Scandinavian sources, but medieval Venetian sources as well. It's rendered in the dark brick as a clear expression of material realism. This building is designed around a series of courtyards, both exterior and interior, open to the sky and enclosed under a dramatic tent-like ceiling. The exterior court is open to the water through a colonnade of medieval columns, and between the courts is the Gold Hall. The ongoing design of this building was well documented in the Swedish architectural press, and due to its importance, its size, and its prominent site, would have been very familiar to an architecture student in Stockholm like Martin Hedmark, and he made several references to this building in his design for Gloria Dei. Around 1910, in contrast to National Romanticism, which set out to create a distinctly national style rooted in craft traditions, Nordic architects began to look at the classical tradition for inspiration, and for a host of reasons, this re-examination of the classical language took root and flourished for the next 20 years. Nordic classicism arose out of, first, National Romanticism was waning as a stylistic school. The nationalist overtones of National Romanticism gravitated away from nostalgic medievalism toward a vernacular primitivism. And classicism, at its root, shared this primitivistic rigor with vernacular building. And there was a continued demand for new civic building types, such as the Stockholm Public Library or the Värmlands Museum that we see here. So this period was characterized by an informal application of French neoclassical sources with a Doric primitiveness. This period characterized buildings with simple, rational plans, which displayed a restraint. Excuse me, a motorcycle just went by. This period is characterized by buildings with simple, rational plans, which displayed a restrained and modest application of classical ornament. The proportions of this unique classical dialect do not conform to the academic rigor of the Beaux-Arts. The details are often attenuated, exaggerated, simplified, and abstracted. We understand the pure, unadulterated sources of the design, the classical column, the anthemion, the baluster, but the effect overall is of a craft-driven architectural naivete. And though the classical architects were looking to early 19th century neoclassicism for form and inspiration, what they achieved was a kind of proto-classicism, described by Dimitri Porphyrius as a Dorian sensibility, a distillation of the classical. It was a language of pure form, laid out with clear logic and exhibiting a taut monumentality. And in order to achieve a sense of lightness, columns were stretched to impossible heights, moldings reduced to their bare essentials, ornament was exaggerated and overscaled, and applied sparingly so that it might stand out against a bare wall. These Nordic architects saw themselves as moderns, and by 1930 they had embraced functionalism of the international style. But for a brief period, they approached the classical tradition in a relaxed manner as a range of possibilities and not as a set of rules. And I just love these particular views of the interiors of Alec Lellerstedt's house in Stockholm, and also this courtyard in the police headquarters in Copenhagen. Just the spare walls, the unadorned architectural features of the arches, the simple coffering of the ceiling, the very minimal moldings around the interior, or in the case of Lellerstedt's house, the piers with the Ionic capitals that extend to a very, very thin beam at the ceiling. So these are two buildings by Peter Behrens and Joseph Hoffmann, which are examples of the German influence on Nordic classicism. And another influence, they were looking back at their own Swedish architecture from the year of the Enlightenment. And unlike the major buildings which were being built on the continent at that time, they were taking the influences and building them with simpler materials. Interiors which were meant to symbolize stone were often painted with faux marble motifs rather than using real marble. And again, the scale of the buildings was much smaller. But another source of inspiration were the visionary architects of the French Enlightenment, Ledoux and Boulez. And we can see the clear rational plans, monumentality, and the sort of Platonic aggregation of forms that we see in those buildings. And then these two buildings, the Carl Johan Skolan in Göteborg by Asplund and Fridhemsplans Gymnasium by Georg Nielsen. We see these attenuated columns, again, these references to classical architecture, but not canonically executed, but still giving an idea of the spirit of the classical. And finally, the idea of Doric primitiveness. This is Asplund Skogskyrkogården Chapel outside of Stockholm. And again, just the simplicity and the primitive quality of this classical building that approaches the vernacular. So we come to Martin Hedmark. And as I said, he graduated from KTH in 1921. He was born in 1896 in Norn, which is a small village as part of the municipality of Hedemora, northwest of Stockholm. His father, Carl August Hedmark, was a clergyman for his career and moved around frequently. He was part of the Archdiocese of Uppsala, which is the premier diocese within Sweden. And the Archbishop of Uppsala is essentially the head of the Swedish Church. And so at Hedmark's birth, his father was appointed to the chapel in Norn, but within a couple of years, they had moved on to Österlövsta, which is east of Hedemora. And you'll notice, I think there are just a couple things about this building that are really interesting. That there's this Lichgate or Stiglucka in Swedish, which is an entry to the churchyard. The idea of these almost Baroque forms of the gable end, and then the brick facade with these incised rendering in plaster, rendered plaster, and the symbol here, which represents the Ten Commandments, the tablets of the Ten Commandments, which we will see at Gloria Dei. So when Hedmark was a teenager, his father actually was appointed to the church in Lidingö, which is an island east of Stockholm, and the family would remain there for the rest of their lives, and in fact become deeply ingrained within society. His father, Carl August Hedmark, was a pastor in the church, and his sister would work for the Swedish sculptor Carl Milles, whose Millesgården overlooks Stockholm harbor from a prominent location about here. So as Hedmark was a student at KTH in 1921, he received his first commission, which was designed at the church at Bo. Boskyrka was completed in 1922. And Hedmark also, so after he graduated, Hedmark got a job with Lars Israel Wallman, his professor at KTH, and one of the first projects that was in the office at the time that Hedmark was there. And I don't know for sure that he worked on this project, but given the similarities between the interiors of this building and Gloria Dei, I think it's likely that Hedmark was heavily influenced by this building, both for Gloria Dei and also for some of his subsequent works during his career. This is a plan of Margareta Kyrka in Oslo, which was built for the Swedish congregation there. So you arrive up these steps into this tower and are turned into the narthex, and then again turned on the axis with the chancel and the altar at this end. Notice also that this wall of the church opens to classrooms and auditoria, and we will see that motif again in Hedmark's work. Here's the interior of Margareta Kyrka, and I just think the arch, notice the paneled ceiling over the chancel, the painted altarpiece, the coloration of the paneling, and these really magnificent light fixtures. Another view of the interior. Again, I think you have a better sense of the painting of the paneling here. Also notice the hymn board, just the simple idea of the classical temple front with a simplified gable with the anthemia on it. We will see that motif again as well. Another view of the interior. So, while Hedmark was still a student, he designed the bridal crown for the church in Lidingö. There's a custom within Sweden that brides who are married in churches wear a crown, which belongs to the church, but for the day of their wedding, they wear this crown. And Hedmark designed this crown, and I think a pretty Byzantine style. It's one of 3 crowns that are owned by the Lidingö parish. But I think it's a really lovely example, and the fact that he designed this while he was still a student, I think is really remarkable. So his first project was Bokirke, which was designed in 1922. We see here not really a clear expression of either the National Romantic or of Nordic Classicism, but sort of a hybrid of both. There's a thin stucco render on the brick, but the entry piece really has almost a medieval quality to it. And as we move to the interior, we see again the replication of the idea of the chancel, the arch. Here we have really beautiful art painted by Ole Hjortsberg, who we will see again. And then these columns on the arcade, which recall the columns in the arcade at the Stockholm City Hall. And then I want to show this older interior view of Bokirke, because I think it shows a really great representation of the painting and the ceiling trusses and on the ceiling purlins that are holding up the roof. It's really pretty dramatic. And also note this light fixture. We will see this again as well. So Bokirke was consecrated in 1923, and presiding at the consecration was Nathan Söderblom, who was the Archbishop of Sweden, and for whom Hedmark's father worked in the diocese. Söderblom was an extremely accomplished man, probably one of the most important men in Sweden at the time. He was a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1930, but he had recently returned from a trip to America, where he had visited Swedish congregations across the country and also engaged in dialogue with members of other faiths. And on his return, he consecrated Bokirke, and he met young Hedmark and recommended to him that he go to America, that there were Swedish communities in the United States that would be well served by his hand. So prior to his departure, Hedmark's last project was a restoration of the 1769 Møllekirke on an island east of Stockholm. A couple things to note here that I think are interesting are the vaulted roof of boards, which recalls an overturned ship's hull, the shape of this balcony with a paneled facade supported by 2 columns, and then also the stained glass window, which was replacing an earlier one, but it's hard to see in this slide, unfortunately, but it is a triangle with an eye known as the all-seeing eye of God, with rays emanating from it representing the Trinity. This is a motif we will see frequently in Hedmark's work. Excuse me, I just want to take a quick drink. So Hedmark left Sweden at the end of 1924, sailing from Gothenburg, arriving in New York on December 4th, stayed in Connecticut with relatives for a while, and sometime by 1925, he was contacted by the parish of Gloria Dei in Providence. The Gloria Dei had initially hired the Providence firm of Jackson, Robertson, and Adams. They had designed this sort of streamlined Gothic revival church. The foundations were built, but then Hedmark took over the job. And just a couple things you will note here are these, this bay, which represents the crossing of the church, this tower on the corner, and then these towers here and here. And then you can see the fragment of a tower here. This is Hedmark's drawing of the design for the church. And we can see he now has this stepped gable tower, a tower here, and suddenly it has a much more sort of Scandinavian flavor, and I'll go in depth into that. So the plan of the church, The plan of the church, you arrive actually at the lower level and can see up through this space into the narthex, and stairs bring you up into the narthex on either side, and I have views of that. Facing you are 6 doors which lead into the nave. This is the overhanging balcony, axial view through the chancel to the altar beyond. Here's the pulpit, and then here are the 2 projecting bays of the, which, for lack of a better term, we can call the crossing. And you can see the heavy bell tower situated here. So the shape of the bell tower actually is a traditional shape from the southern portion of Sweden, the province of Skåne, which at one time had been a Danish province, but had become Swedish during the 18th century. But this stepped Hanseatic gable was not uncommon in churches in Skåne, and Hedmark made a direct reference to those Swedish churches with this gable end on his bell tower. In addition, the tower on the west front, I think, bears a very strong reference to the main tower cupola at Stockholm City Hall by Ragnar Östberg. And then the secondary tower, also at Gloria Dei, has a similarity to one of the other towers at the Stockholm City Hall. So Hedmark was taking direct references from contemporary Swedish architecture and bringing them to America, not to make a clear reference about contemporary Sweden for the parishioners of the churches that he was working on. And we can see here that he replicated this idea of this blind arch with a single width of brick that we had previously seen at Engelbrechtskirke by Wallman and also at Grytholmsslott. And I just wanted to show this slide of the exterior doors at Gloria Dei because I just think they're just so fantastic. These massive strap hinges, and the symbolism and iconography makes it even into these. Here we see a symbol of the serpent in the Garden of Eden on the branch of a tree, or a dragon's head on the bow of a Viking ship, or the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. And then also these wonderful Solomonic colonnettes in the windows flanking the front entry, which have that Byzantine quality, recalling the medievalism at the root of national romanticism. And then over the front door, excuse me, over the front door, we have this marvelous little angel on the light fixture, which I think is a clear reference to Carl Millis's Angel of Death at the Skogskyrkogården by Asplund. And I just want to talk a little bit about the entry facade. This really fanciful Baroque composition with these crossettes curving out at the base, the little bits of entablature breaking up the archivolt, the voussoirs that penetrate the archivolt. And you'll also notice here the muntins on the stained glass window actually have a slight S curve to them. So there's this remarkable playfulness to all of the work that Hedmark did. And it manifests itself in so many different ways. And at 4 points here, 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 and here are these little angels' heads with wings, which are thought to represent the 4 Gospels, the 4 evangelists. And at the top of the keystone is this parabolic arch recalling Wallmann's Engelbrechtskirke, and then a representation of the Epiphany. And we can see that the idea of this cross and this within this arch directly reflects the painting of the Ascension done by Danish artist Benny Cohen, which is at the altarpiece beyond. View of the stained glass window for the rose window, and I just think these really wonderful, almost Art Deco-esque cornucopias, and this almost suggestion of an Ionic capital in this location. One other thing I want to talk about is the coursing of the brick. This is known as a raking monk bond. Monk bond is a fairly typical brick coursing in Northern Europe. This is a particularly complicated brick coursing for really skillful masons to lay. A monk bond typically has a single header over 2 stretchers, at the joint and repeats every other joint. However, with a raking monk bond, the repeat actually occurs every 10 courses. And it's incredibly difficult to lay, and you have to be extremely careful about the way you work out the brick. So again, this is a celebration of the craftsman that we see in the National Romantic, and also Hedmark's deep attention to detail with all the projects he worked on. I also want to show this example of a window which is actually seen on the balcony on the interior of the church, but I think it bears a clear reference to the large windows at the Stockholm City Hall by Östberg. And then in the tower of Engelbrecht Kyrka, there are these wonderful sounding canopies in copper, and we see them replicated by Hedmark here. And you can also see, like at Engelbrecht Kyrka, there is this motif of the tablets of the Ten Commandments. And then the formerly gilded crucifix at the top of the tower. And again, I think there's a clear reference to Sweden here. I think that the rays that emanate from the cross are actually a direct reference to the Tre Kronor, or the three crowns, which are the symbol of the Kingdom of Sweden. And we can see them here, here, and here. And then also Stockholm Stadhuset, or City Hall, there's this Nordic star at the finial, and we see a similar star in Providence. So entering the church, you come into this lower narthex and are led up these stairs by the bright light coming in through these lunette windows. And just to show some of the detail of the ironwork here, the craftsmanship in this building is really astounding and really fanciful. Just even look at this handrail. And arriving at the upper level, we're faced with these really strange balusters, which I think have a direct antecedent in Asplund's Lister County Courthouse. And then arriving in the upper hall, I think this, if we look at this image, it really recalls that image I showed you earlier of Eric Lellerstedt's own house, the entry hall. But there are these wonderful sets of doors facing the sanctuary. And the one really sort of overtly classical piece we have is this Egendart molding in these piers. And then also, you're really struck by the number of these really exotic sconces that were designed by Hedmark, with the shell motif and the cornucopia. And I think they bear a direct antecedent from the Stockholm's Concerthuset by Ivar Tengbom, which was completed around the same time. And then just looking at that motif of that pier with the Egendart molding. And if you look here, you can see just the very faint chiseling in the stone. The chase work is really, really elegant. And it's the kind of subtle detail that you don't often get in buildings. And looking at the front door, the doors to the main sanctuary, there's this really fanciful ironwork, and each of the doors has a enameled figure significant within the particularly within the Swedish Lutheran Church. And I think that these grills, again, are strongly influenced by Asplund's gates at the Skogskyrkogården outside of Stockholm. And just these are some views of some of the figures, and I think they're really quite lovely and really fanciful. There's Martin Luther, Saint Eric, Saint Birgitta. And then also within these grills, we have a Viking ship, again recalling the Nordic heritage, a crescent moon, the apple on the tree in the Garden of Eden, and from the Old Testament, the dove with the olive sprig returning to Noah's Ark. And then entering through the doors into the church, we suddenly enter the realm of the Nordic classical. And I think you can feel already the similarities to this interior to what Wallman had done at Margareta Kyrka in Oslo. And looking at Margareta Kyrka, we see these deep recessed arches, and then even this motif of this little niche high on the wall is repeated by Hedmark in Providence. And the shape of these recessed curves, the arch within the vault that we see at Stockholm City Hall by Östberg. And then there are these really magnificent light fixtures, which are inverted obelisks with these shell motifs shielding each of the lights, the reflectors, and they are in a shell motif, and the shell is symbolic of the Eucharist and baptism. And then each of the light fixtures is crowned by 4 angels, again, the 4 evangelists. But there are these wonderful attenuated acanthus leaves from classicism. And then on the balcony, there's an inverted light fixture, which is a torchère, which has these really odd sort of cubist shapes to it. And then the painted on anthemions, which I think is just really a magnificent, wonderful thing. And then on the opposite wall, because we have the huge piers for the bell tower coming through, symmetrically about the center of the balcony, there's this embedded light fixture into the corner of the pier. And I think it's that kind of inventiveness and playfulness that really characterizes Hedmark's work. So just 2 more views of the light fixtures. Again, we see that repetition of the shell motif. This is the light fixture over the altar. And then there are these wonderful radiator covers within each of the arches that have a torchère as a bundled fascia with a reflector in hammered brass, and then crenellations at the top of this, and then embossed within the field is wheat and the chalice symbolizing the Eucharist, and then a bowl symbolizing baptism. And these are the 2 most fundamental sacraments within the Lutheran Church. And then just this wonderful sort of neoclassical device of these arches at the base of the radiator cover really fascinate me. And then also looking at Ivar Tengboom's concert hall in Stockholm, there's this really attenuated pediment with a very, very thin whisper of a cornice. And we see that idea repeated at the crossings by Hedmark at Gloria Dei. And then also the idea of the Eucharist, the chalice form, which we see in the windows in the tower, but also minutely in these sconces, which are at the rear of the sanctuary. There are only 2 of these round sconces, and that attention to detail just fascinates me. The sounding board of the pulpit, and there are these wonderful Nordic stars, the drapery with a sort of neoclassical influence, and the coloration, which harkens back to Scandinavian churches, traditional sort of muted palettes and subtle gilding. But again, the very inventive shapes that he works with, I just find it fascinating. So these are, sort of typical views and palettes from Scandinavian churches. So Hedmark was bringing all of this Swedish iconography and design to this one church. And then again, we see this light over the reredos, and these wonderful, fanciful designs in this attenuated finial, which feels very classical, but it doesn't necessarily refer to the classical vocabulary. And lastly, this wonderful balcony railing. I was speaking to Dr. Kim Eric Williams, and he actually suggested that perhaps these spiderweb railings referred to people falling asleep in the balcony during a long sermon, and that the cobwebs would be growing. And I think this speaks about Hedmark's humor and the fancifulness of a lot of his work. But you have to admit, it's an unusual motif to see in a church. And then the beauty of this Nordic blue ceiling and the lovely stencil work around the perimeter of the coffers. It's really striking. And then finally, the all-seeing eye of God, or the eye of Providence as it is known. And I have to believe that Hedmark was making a little bit of a pun with the choice of the eye of Providence in the city of Providence. And then we also see the eye of Providence on the facade. It was rendered in brickwork on both sides of the front door in slightly different versions, again, calling up the idea of craft and the idea of material realism in the National Romantic movement. And so lastly, I want to talk briefly about the altarpiece, which is this really lovely painting of the Ascension by Benny Cohen. Benny Cohen was a Danish artist. He had studied in Paris in the 20s, and I'm not sure how he ended up in Providence when he did, but Hedmark tapped him to paint the first of what would be many collaborations between them that would last through the 50s. Cohen traveled back to Denmark and returned to the United States in 1939 on the eve of the Second World War with his father to escape Denmark. Since they were Jews, they needed to leave. But these are some details from the painting. It's really lovely. He actually had a retrospective of his work in Sarasota, Florida, about 6 years ago, and his work is starting to be more and more recognized. And here's a self-portrait by Cohen. For years, he lived in Newport, actually. He was the caretaker of Belcourt Castle. And while he was living there, he and Hedmark would hook up again in the 50s. Hedmark returned to Stockholm in 1927. His brother-in-law, Arvid Klosterborg, was designing a viaduct over a service road at the Grönelund amusement park in Stockholm. And again, we see this sort of fanciful representation of a classically inspired tower with the Nordic star and the moon. And I think that this design bears a strong influence from the Gothenburg Tercentennial Jubilee Exposition of 1923, which was one of the first representations of Nordic classicism sort of to a broader audience in 1923, and it really moved Swedish architects in this direction strongly. Hedmark's next work was the first Swedish Baptist church in New York, and completed around 1930. Hedmark had set up an office at 301 Madison Avenue at 41st Street and worked out of there. This church, I think, bears a really fascinating articulation of the facade. These two adjacent towers, the change in the brick color, which separates it into three separate volumes, the stepped facade, which has a very almost Low Countries feel to it. And I think also this church probably has a strong influence from the Grundtvigs church in Copenhagen by Peter Klint. And then these two towers, this was referencing a Swedish church in Western Sweden, and this from the north, and you can see the almost Russian dome from the northern part of Sweden. And again, the fanciful strap hinges on the door, this really oddly proportioned, very playful piece of granite that was brought from Sweden to flank the front door, and then the magnificent grille work on this service door. And then the skill of the graduated brick tones on this facade, and we'll see these colors recur again in another project. So look, just give me a second. So this is the plan of what is now Trinity Baptist Church on 61st Street. You enter into the lower level into this steep steps bringing you up to the main floor of the church. And there are these pairs of columns at the corners. So this is the entry through these brick stairs, and this has almost a more German expressionist feel to it. And there are these wonderful handrails with lions, and you can see also the lion's foot as the escutcheon against the brick pier. And the painting, the fresco on the ceiling of the narthex is by the Swedish artist Ola Nordmark. And on the interior, it's this great, enormous space. The altar was moved recently to a little further back, but it used to sit a little farther forward. And then these wonderful stairs taking you up to the balcony. And just the sort of bizarre, very original detailing, which seems rooted in history, but at the same time is incredibly playful and transformative. A view of the baptismal pool at the rear of the sanctuary. And I love the play here of the clearly handmade ironwork with the clearly mass-produced tile work. It's a glimpse of modernity and tradition sort of all wound together. And then there's this really delightful handrail that Hedmark designed, which takes you from the chancel up to the balconies. And then the drum over the center of the church, I think really is a clear reference to Asplin's drum at the Stockholm Public Library. And again, we see the all-seeing eye of God representing the Trinity with the three rays and the triangle at the peak of the drum. And then also this fabulous fresco that lines the balcony, which has sheaves of wheat and implies these columns coming through. And you can see it even more clearly here. Here's the column, and then just the representation of the column coming through the balcony as painted with these fanciful organic images on them. And so this was actually published in Architectural Form in 1931. And these are column covers for steel I-section structural columns. And within Architectural Form, they actually called out this detail because they thought that it was so fascinating. But I have to say, I think that Hedmark was actually cribbing it from the Stockholm's Concerthuset. If you look here, you can see there's this flared out capital, and then this column with a repeating floral motif on it. And we see the same kind of idea in this pier at the Stockholm Concert Hall with this flared capital. And then the all-seeing eye of God. So this church, First Lutheran in Kearney, New Jersey, was Hedmark's next project. And it's really, it's a delightful little church. And Hedmark, here's an image of Hedmark at the laying of the cornerstone in 1930. And the plan here is really interesting because looking at the site plan here, here's the street. It was on a very narrow site. So he used a steglucka or lich gate out on the street for the bell tower, and then set the facade of the church well back from the street. And again, the idea that we had seen at Margaretakirke of having one wall of the side of the sanctuary open up and giving a view of classrooms beyond is something he repeated. Here are views from the American Architect in 1932. So the church was well thought of at the time. And here's an interior view. And just a couple things to point out. I think that this altarpiece really bears a resemblance to what was happening at Gloria Dei on the front facade. And then also this really fanciful, the bosses on the ceiling of this, of the ceiling over the chancel. So here's a view of the gate. And again, we have the parabolic arches, which are a clear reference to Engelbrechtskirche by Wallmann. The gates, which are very similar, the ironwork is very similar to the work that we saw in Providence. Another view of that. And then unfortunately, there was a sun and a star that had been on the top of those gates. They have subsequently been lost, but it would be lovely to be able to restore those. Also, the side of the lich gate has this small parabolic arched window. And then the main facade of the church, again, we see graduated brick like at Trinity, and then this deeply glazed red brick for the center section, which has an almost Gothic proportion to it. Shot of the front door, which these lozenges are very typical of Swedish churches. And then you get to the interior, and there wasn't as much of a budget here. So he was very careful about the details that he made. But so there's a handcraft sort of folk art quality to these columns as you come just inside the door. And then inside the church, here's a view looking from the balcony toward the altar. And then calling from Moyakirke, which I had shown you earlier, the vaulted ceiling with the running boards implying an inverted ship's hull. We see the same motif realized here by Hedmark in Kearney. And then also the balcony rail with the two columns, and we see that again at Moyakirke. So I think Moyakirke is a clear precedent for what was happening on the interior at Kearney. And just some of the beauty of these faux painted balconies. Another sort of quirky detail are the pair of arches of different sizes separated by a very abstracted Ionic column. And then between them, the sounding board on this corbel. And then so at the sounding board, we get, again, the classical reference of the anthemia at the corners. And then notice also this snake-like motif referencing the Garden of Eden. But they're also just the beauty of these turnbuckles and the attachment of the tension rod to support the canopy, and then bearing it on this corbel. I think it's really lovely and inventive. And then a view of the pulpit, which again, with these shapes, I think is recalling the window at Gloria Dei in Providence. I see we're almost, I should be wrapping up fairly soon. I think I probably have another 10 minutes. Comparing the altarpiece in Carney, we can see these notches that are carved out of it. And I think that there's a clear reference from this altarpiece to the entry arch at Gloria Dei. And then just the beauty of this blue ceiling and these marvelous bosses which are applied, and then the painting of the gilding on the beams is really spectacular. And then within the main body of the church, there are these designs which, in American Architect in 1932, they actually say they felt that they were American Indian motifs, but I'm desperately searching for the sources. I'm convinced that these are actually Nordic motifs. And I spoke to Dr. Williams about this, and he agreed with me. So I've got at least one supporter on that. Hedmark's next work was an Art Deco room heavily influenced by Art Deco ocean liner interiors from the 30s at the Swedish American Museum in Philadelphia. This dates from 1936. This is a room to celebrate Swedish inventor John Ericsson, who conceived both of the screw propeller and also created the monitor, which engaged the CSS Virginia during the Civil War, also known as the Merrimack. And there's this wonderful mural by Ole Hjortsborg. But you can see the wonderful use of woods. So even in this modernist vocabulary, Hedmark still is really engaged in the idea of craft and materials. And even the frescoes on the wall opposite with all sorts of references to industry, the steam engine, sailing ships. And here's a view of Hjortsborg's view of Ericsson showing the design to Lincoln, and then the Battle of the Monitor and the Virginia. And then this fanciful light fixture designed by Hedmark, which is meant to recall the idea of a screw propeller, which was invented by Ericsson. And there's some details of this marvelous curved glass and the stainless steel inset within the ebonized wood. So across the hall at the Swedish American Museum is the Chicago Room. This was designed in 1938. And although this, I think, is an exceptionally modern room, there are still references to classical architecture that occur within it. That the paneling of the drawer fronts recalls a rusticated base, and that these piers recall classical columns with the faintest of capitals on them. I think you get a better sense of that here. And then this Intarsia by Ewald Dalskog, a Swedish artist. I came across a couple of letters in the collection of the Swedish American Museum in Philadelphia. That Hedmark was in Sweden while this was all being executed, and he was working closely with Dalskog. And he was writing back and forth to the museum director, requesting payment for all the artists that had been engaged to work on these two rooms. And at the end of it, he included a request to be paid for his services and requested the exorbitant sum of $100 for about three years of work to pull this all together, which works out to about $1,200 today. So architects were badly paid even then. And here's this wonderful photograph of Dalskog working up the cartoon for the Intarsia while he's working in his studio in Stockholm. And then just some details of the millwork. which I think is really lovely. It's very modern, but at the same time, I think it has a historical reference to it. The last big project I'm going to show you is Bethany Lutheran Church in Jersey City, New Jersey. By now, Hedmark had become, was embracing a more modern vocabulary, but there's, even within this modern building, I think there are still references to craft and to the historical churches that he had worked on in Sweden. But when you walk in, there's just this magnificent stained glass window. It absolutely illuminates the whole space. Comparing the plan of Margarita Schirka with a walk up to the tower, entry into the narthex, and then turning on axis to face the altar in the chancel, we have a similar kind of relationship. You enter a corner tower, come into the back of the church, and backlit stained glass window here, but here's the altar in the chancel. So even in this modern building, Hedmark is resurrecting this idea of the traditional. And here's a view of the interior. And the sounding board, I think, even in a very sort of abstracted way, references the sounding boards that he had done at in Kearney and at Gloria Dei in Providence. This quick shot, this is a former Lebanon Lutheran Church in Bristol, Connecticut. He did a renovation of it and created this stepped tower referencing the churches of Skåne. This was a renovation of an earlier church. It is now a Salvation Army, but I understand the interiors are still largely intact. I only found out about this church after COVID had struck, so I have yet to see it, but it's on my list of places I want to see. In Worcester, Massachusetts, he executed a small project in 1948 to do a small chapel for the Faith Chapel of Zion Lutheran Church in Worcester. And for me, what's the most interesting part about this is the fresco that Hedmark himself painted along one wall. There wasn't a lot of money to develop the design of this space. And so the bulk of the decoration is actually this really fascinating fresco. But the one sort of fanciful device are these door pulls in brass on the steel doors, which I think are just, they're so quirky and so wonderful. And they speak a lot about Hedmark's design sense. So within the fresco, we have an image of Jan Jeppsson, who was a Swedish potter who later emigrated to the United States. But we see a willow tree and an elm tree, and carved within them, we see a Viking warrior looking backward towards Sweden, and Abraham Lincoln, an American Indian, looking to the east. So in the background, we have a stepped gable church from Skåne, and on the other side, we have a typical New England village scene of a white church. And then here's a detail of the fresco version of that Skåne-style church. And then opposite it, we have an angel blessing what was the Norton factory. Jan Jeppsson invented the emery wheel for grinding and became a chief engineer at Norton. And those grinding wheels, we see a potter of a workman, clearly of Scandinavian ancestry, who's working at Norton. And then I just love the signature of Hedmark's that's on the fresco. And then I think I had shown you this light fixture at Botkyrka earlier in Sweden. And it's interesting that nearly 25 years later, he replicates that same exact, or almost that same exact light fixture at Faith Chapel. One last project. There's really not much information about this. This church was never built, but going back through the archives of the Newport Daily News in Newport, Rhode Island, I came across a bunch of entries. And in 1954, it announced that Martin Hedmark, the esteemed Swedish architect, had come to Newport and was going to study colonial architecture and design a church for the Lutheran congregation at 1 Mile Corner in Newport. And then in a couple of years later, it stated that he had moved into the library at at Elmhurst, which is at 1 Mile Corner. It's a wonderful Greek Revival mansion, and he was living there with Benny Cohen. And then Cohen later went on to be the caretaker at Belcourt Castle. And then the last entry that I found, about 1958, it said that Hedmark's items, personal effects, were up for auction in a public auction in Newport for people who had defaulted on their rent. So at that point, he had moved to Philadelphia, where he had taken a job with Harold Wagoner, who was an ecclesiastical architect. But I wanted to couple last things here. The woman on the lower right with the dark hair and the pearls and the earrings is Anne Hedmark, who was Martin Hedmark's sister. She was the assistant to Carl Milles, the famed Swedish sculptor. And there's Anne's house at the Millsgården in Stockholm, which was actually her home. And she remains the curator of the Millsgården after Carl Milles' death. And here she is showing Nina Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev's wife, around the Millsgården in the 50s. But because of the connection to Carl Milles, some of you may recall the old Metropolitan Museum restaurant. This space is now the center of the Antiquities Wing at the Metropolitan Museum, but Dorothy Draper designed this fabulous restaurant in the 50s. And the sculpture in the pool is the Fountain of the Muses by Carl Milles. And in the story I will get onto, it is believed that Martin Hedmark was actually the model for the live figure dancing across the pool, and that he probably posed for this at some point in the 1930s. So I just want to, this quote from Martin Hedmark, I think is kind of astute. The church stands as a symbol of our faith in the Lord. Honesty of construction is essential to all good architecture in the same way as we regard honesty and truth essential to our relationship with the Lord. For Hedmark, a deeply religious man and the son of a pastor, he could not separate the iconography of his culture and the iconography of the church. But the idea about building well, using true materials, was something that was very important to him. And I think that spirit infused all of the work that he did. And finally, this is my final slide, and I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over. But I spoke a year ago to Harriet Day, who in 1960 was married to Marko Zubar, who was a Ukrainian architect and artist who had done some really wonderful stained glass windows. If any of you who have ever actually been to the Air Force Academy chapel in Colorado that was done by SOM, Marko Zubar did all the stained glass on the interior of that. But he was somewhat older than Harriet, and she was quite young when they married. And they both worked in the office of Harold Wagoner in Philadelphia. And Harriet said that they both lived close to 22nd and Spruce, and that Marko would often invite Martin over, and they would drink a bottle of wine and argue politics late into the night. And Martin would crash on on their sofa and get up in the morning with his toupee askew and kiss her hand goodbye and go home. She described him as a funny little man, but incredibly charming and incredibly cultured and articulate and precise. And I just love this image of him playing his violin for her at her, what I think was her 20th birthday. And she sent me this photograph. And so I'd like to conclude the talk with that shot. So that's it.
Wow, Eric, that was absolutely wonderful. I mean, I just learned so much, and it basically the thoughts of traditional, modern, there are just so many aspects of it. It's just fascinating. Thank you.
Well, thanks.
So,
are there any questions? Or dead silence?
So we have a couple questions and a couple things in the chat, but the Q&A button, which I believe is at the bottom, if anybody has any questions, just throw them up. First question comes from Paul Gunther. Were any of his designs destroyed, or are they all preserved?
I understand there was a church in Torrington which has been demolished, and there have been other churches. There's also a parish in West Haven, Connecticut, which I think is still going. But the church in Torrington was destroyed, but the altarpiece was moved to another church in Torrington. There's also a church in upstate New York, sort of between Erie and Buffalo, that has an altarpiece by Benny Cohen. But I believe the Hedmark church that had been there was destroyed. He also did some work for Emmanuel Church in Chicago, but that was mostly interior work, and allegedly designed a church in Colorado that I don't know if it was ever built or not. But actually, one thing I will add is that I think a lot of these churches are in danger. Speaking to Dr. Williams, he mentioned to me that Kearney, the First Lutheran in Kearney, New Jersey, had a church membership of about 800 people in the 1950s. I've spoken to and met the church secretary and the sexton, and they're lovely people, and they were so excited that someone had come to their church. Typically, they get about 14 people on a service now on a Sunday. And I know that Gloria Dei was on sort of hard times now, but there is now an ecumenical non-affiliated church which is using the space on Sunday afternoons, and they draw very large numbers. But they have not been particularly respectful of the architecture. They've strung lights up through the space. They've nailed a video screen into Benny Cohen's altarpiece. And it's a little disappointing.
So
it's a really lovely building, but it's definitely in much worse shape now than it was when I last seen it in 2013.
we at one point, were you in discussions of having some sort of having the talk there at
I gave a talk at Gloria Dei in 2013 for the Providence Preservation Society.
But-
And in fact, that if anybody's interested, David Brusset, who's a board member of our chapter for the ICAA, has posted a version of that talk on his blog, Architecture Here and There.
I'm just wondering, it just seems like a natural thing to reach out and see if we can just reproduce this live there in the future, just to see if it somehow resonates with their parish.
It might. It might. I'd be happy to reach out to them.
Right. And so somebody asked, can it be toured today? Is it generally open like a?
I don't know if it can be toured. I called Pastor Rodriguez. So Gloria Dei still functions. It's a predominantly Hispanic parish now. Pastor Rodriguez was very welcoming to me last year. I went back in, got just to take a few last photographs, and I just called him up and asked if I could come in, and he was very willing to have me come and see it.
Wow. That's fascinating. You're getting so many comments here. Just what a wonderful presentation that you gave. I'll just assume that all 44 people, I mean, you just blew them away. This was just absolutely fantastic. So let's see. Thank you. Is the Zion Lutheran, the huge Lutheran church opposite the, oh.
No.
Yeah, okay.
No, that's, so from what I understand, within Worcester, that large church, which I think is Trinity, I could be mistaken, is clearly designed in the Swedish style, but that was the grander church for people from the fancy end of town. That basically all the owners of industry worshipped there. Zion Lutheran is north of downtown, up on a hill. It's a small parish, and most of the parishioners were workers at the Norton companies.
So Fred Atherin mentions actually in the chat that spider webs can also be a symbol of industriousness. The parish was composed of highly skilled immigrant Scandinavian machinists of Brown and Sharp and other high-tech mills of the day. That's a really sort of interesting point.
Hi, Fred. I remember you making that point about 8 years ago. And I actually, I'm sorry I didn't bring it up. Yes, I totally agree with you. I think that that's entirely the case.
It's amazing to drill down on this sort of connectivity, or this search for, and I'm going to call it nature. And I just wonder if it's actually driven sort of as part of the sort of picturesque movement, which was over a 200-year period, was rolling right through at that point, where people were sort of, let's call it nationalism, call it regionalism, call it a search for place and soul. And then I just think it's fascinating, the whole modernism getting brought into that and how pieces of it affect it positively. And I think sort of, yeah, I think you mentioned oddly and awkwardly or at a couple points, but it's just fascinating.
Well, I think, for me, what's always fascinating is the tension between modernity and tradition. Um, my undergraduate training in architecture was largely historical or historicist, and then my graduate school training was modernist. And I'm sure that um, there was always that tension, and I was constantly trying to do traditional buildings within a modernist design studio, which got me in a lot of trouble. But I think that this particularly Scandinavian idea of modernism or modernity was as much about an evolving culture and evolving social institutions and the urbanization that was occurring. Sweden lost about half of its population in the latter part of the 19th century due to immigration to the United States. And then also of this largely rural agrarian society was rapidly urbanized. Gothenburg had been quite a small city prior to 1900 and grew enormously, and Stockholm also grew enormously. And there was a drastic need for building. And there was this professionalization of the building trades. They went from having master builders to having professional architects. There was the architecture school at Kungliga Tekniska Högskolan. There was the Chalmers Institute in Gothenburg. So they were suddenly churning out a lot of architects, and there was a great passion, not just among the architects, but within the whole society for these evolving buildings. And it's really, there's some stunning work that was done at that time.
I found his work compared to some of the other works, not all other works, but some of the other works, but his in particular, you mentioned the word canons, his respect of architectural precedent, architectural balance, precedent, reinterpreting it according to the canons and laws, even though what came out is sort of almost Gaudi-esque. I mean, and I say that in the most wonderful complimentary way, but truly, as opposed to some of the other examples where the modernism got to a point where it almost became postmodernism and pastiche, where I felt like even his balance, not only his balance of proportions, but also, you mentioned craft, his appreciation and his reliance on the hand and the human being and being integrated into that was just beautiful. I'm talking too much, but I was just blown away.
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting is just, as architects, we would love to have the opportunity to design every square inch, every fixture, every element that goes into our buildings. And unfortunately, because of the economies of the way we work, we're forced to use a certain number of stock parts. But Hedmark designed every element within his buildings. And one thing I'd like to add is I think he had a really weird sense of proportion. Some of his stuff is just flat out strange. But the quirkiness is what I think makes it so charming. And he is a relatively minor figure with just a handful of buildings to his name. But the fact that they significantly represent these two architectural movements within Scandinavia and Finland from the early part of the 20th century, as the sole examples within the United States, I think is really meaningful. And those two languages speak about the idea that we can be modern and still pay respects to tradition.
Fantastic. Can you see the chat on the side?
No, I can't actually.
Okay.
Should I stop sharing?
Well, no. There are some long comments. I think there are a lot of comments to you, a lot of thank yous to you.
So I did notice there was one question: is Gloria Dei protected? And no, it is not. I think it has landmark status within Providence, but the interiors are just as significant as the exterior, and I think they're probably more in danger than the exterior. I do know that Cornelius de Boer had done some restoration work on one of the towers about 10 years ago, and he's a significant preservation architect in Providence. I'm noticing there's one comment here talking about Providence's economic decline having started when Gloria Dei was built. And his curiosity if the Swedish congregation was concentrated in a certain industry or profession. I think Fred Atherton actually answered that, that a lot of the people, the skilled craftsmen worked at Brown and Sharp. Another thing that I think is interesting to think about Hedmark's work is Gloria Dei was built at the height of the economic boom in the 20s. And there was a lot of money that went into that church. The two subsequent churches, Trinity in New York and Kearney in New Jersey, were built right after the stock market crash, and there just wasn't the same amount of money available. But still, I think within more limited budgets, he was able to achieve a really craft-driven architecture. And yes, Fred, I know that Hayes Street used to go through to Brown and Sharp. And I see the reference to McGinnis and Walsh, who were the Catholic architects out of Boston who did a lot of really significant buildings. I'm just sort of skimming these comments really fast. Well, does anybody else have any specific questions? I guess not, right?
This is wonderful. Eric, thank you.
Shall we call it a day?
I think we should. I think you were a superstar, and I thank you so much. Yeah. And I look forward to seeing everybody at our future lectures. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.